The challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of faith. Nearly 60 years later, during these challenging times, we'll take a new look at our divisions, our connections, in a new program called Challenge 2.0. Emotional exile. It's a term that's increasingly descriptive of life in the United States. Although we may physically remain in our country, our state, even our neighborhood, political and social polarization is resulting in an increased sense of disconnection, despair, and even loneliness. When what is doesn't match our view of what should be, how can we cope? That's the subject of this week's edition of Challenge 2.0, Living as Exiles in Our Own Land. So we're delighted to have three very special guests on, I think, to give us some very real perspectives in these issues that are troubling so many of us. We welcome back Rabbi Ted Falcon, Imam Jamal Rahman, and Pastor Dave Brown. Thank you, each of you, for joining us once again. It's good to be back together, if not in studio, virtually.
Right, it's great to be here.
It's good to see you.
It's delightful.
In looking at our topic today, the polarization that we've experienced leads, I think, many people to the feeling that although we may be living in our own land, it isn't really ours. I'm wondering if there are any examples that you've witnessed recently that really serve to highlight that.
I think we're living at a time of such increased anxiety and such increased sense of distrust, suspicion, polarization, that it's hard not to experience a kind of alienation and an increased distance from each other. The lack of civil discourse, the radical changes that COVID-19 has created, the increasingly volatile atmosphere, just bordering always on violence. I think for a lot of us, we experience living in a transformed land. We experience living with a level of anxiety and a level of discomfort, and above all, a level of uncertainty.
You see, as a Muslim, in this time of Islamophobia, it makes me feel that I don't have a sense of belonging. And that not just affects me or my community, it makes the entire society dysfunctional. We always say a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. But more than that, from what Brother Ted said, it's more a general feeling of a spiritual malaise, a moral decay that has set in, where everything is ego-driven, by the leadership, by some sections of the population, where these, divine qualities we always talk about, we are taught of oneness, compassion, love. They're supplanted by, those ego qualities of fear, division, hatred. So I would say individually and collectively, we all feel that there is a wound. It's the wound that needs to be healed. There's a wonderful saying by Rumi who says, students of cunning have consumed their hearts and learned only tricks. They have thrown away real riches, graciousness, generosity, compassion, love. And that is a real problem I feel we are facing today.
Brother Jamal and I spent 45 minutes last week with some student leaders at the University of Puget Sound, prepping for a program that Brother Ted, Brother Jamal, and I are doing later in November. And their conversation echoed so much with what my two brothers said. Those students at that wonderful institution feel anxious. They don't know how to get along with others. They don't know what the future holds in the midst of so much deception and so much hostility. And they were sort of yearning for the three of us to offer some connection to something more. And it was palpable in our Zoom meeting with those students. And from our generation, looking down at handing that world to that generation was very sobering to me. When I think about being an exile in the land, it raises the question for me, where is my home? Am I grounded in a political reality with political borders like the United States of America or Canada? Or, and this has been the case for me over the last 6 months, am I driven more to a sense of unity and a sense of seeking to be home on the planet or in all creation, and not simply have my identity bound by the political boundaries of the country where I happen to be born? So I'm trying to be at home in a planetary sense, as well as feeling, as I feel, exiled in the political reality where I live right now.
If we move from a very short-term perspective to one going back through the ages, from each of your faith traditions, what examples might be drawn as parallels to where we are at right now?
You know, whenever we talk about the experience of exile, I'm part of a people that has lived in exile, you know, for millennia, you know, that had our land ripped away from us time and time again. People that was taken into captivity, that was exiled, returned, whether it was Babylonia, whether it was Assyria before that, whether it was Rome, whether it was Christians, whether it was Muslims, you know, taking over the territory. So this sense of maintaining an identity, when essentially being stripped of the geographical foundation, you know, for that identity, is something that we Jews have known. And although we strive to be, you know, to fit in and to be accepted in other cultures, United States is actually the first country where we were allowed to vote. Even though there were countries with greater or lesser oppression, we were never accorded full citizenship prior to this. And yet, even in this country, there are more anti-Semitic acts, both physical violence as well as community property, more anti-Semitic acts than any other acts against any other religious group. You know, so there's something that still lives even in the American psyche, that keeps us aware in one way or another that in some ways this is still not our country, and striving to feel as welcome and as a part of it as we possibly can.
You know, these times of moral decay where we have become exiles, we're really separated from our own soul. This actually is the pattern of history. And we, through Interprete Amigos, we actually talk about it where, you know, great beings come and they call us back. So in the 7th century, Arabia, when it was really a time of savagery and corruption on all levels of society, the Prophet Muhammad, he called everyone back from the worship of the ego, the little self that worships money and power. And in the Arabian Peninsula, he declared, La ilaha illallah, there is no God but God, meaning bring divinity in the center of your life, individually and collectively, and not your ego. And he famously said, you know, if you see injustice, a wrong, he said, use your hands, meaning get engaged, do something, participate. whether it's protests, lobbying, voting, creating allies, use your hands, get engaged. If you cannot do that, he said, use your mouth, speak out against the injustices. If you cannot do that, he said, then yes, pray from your heart. But please know, in this instance, it's the weakest form of faith.
And Jesus, in the same way, called people back to the heart of his tradition, to a way of doing justice, walking humbly with your God. He didn't teach 4 spiritual laws that you need to believe to be okay. He invited people to trust that which was beyond them, the reality they call God, and to be in a world in a way that demonstrates love for neighbor. In one of the longest parables in Matthew 25 about the afterlife, the people, the sheep and the goats, are not separated because of the right things they believe, but because of the compassion they showed to those that Jesus called the least of these, those that were hungry, those that were in prison, those that were naked, those that were vulnerable. So Jesus called people back to a spirituality not rooted in checking off all the boxes of belief, but rooted in a way of being present to oneself and being present in the world.
As we look at what inspiration we can draw, from the displacement. In 1990, actually, the Dalai Lama, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, convened a group of rabbis. It actually started in 1989 in New York when he met with a group of rabbis, and then he decided to invite people to Dharamsala in India in 1990. Basically, since his people are in exile, he wanted to know, how does a people maintain their identity in a situation of exile? And that is something that is, I think, inspiring in terms of the Jewish community and commitment to Torah, to a teaching that transcends place. And it doesn't make place not important. And certainly the Second World War and the Nazi atrocities demonstrated the absolute need for a safe refuge, when we were not welcomed, trying to escape the savagery of the Nazi era. But what really allowed us to survive and still is so strong is a spiritual truth and a spiritual message, a message of oneness and a message of deep love and a message of compassion.
You mentioned talking to a group of students, I believe Dave and Jamal. How would you build on what Rabbi Ted said in terms of what you gave as lessons that could be drawn and things that they could act on when you were speaking to those young people?
One, I think I would invite them to think of the places and the times where they do feel at home and not in exile, and to remember those places and to be intentional in their lives about finding time to be in that space. If it's nature, if it's playing the piano, wherever, but it helps you feel grounded, to pay attention to that and to take control of what's going into your life, and to be clear about what you need to do to remember who you are. And there's a part of me that's never been fully at home, that always recognizes there's a little disconnect from my true heart, from what is around me. And that maybe that sense of not fully belonging or not really being connected is something not to feel bad about, but to embrace as the reality of trying to live in this world.
And of course, this exile for the students has forced us to be by ourselves. This is a wonderful time. It's difficult, though, to really connect with oneself, because this is something which is lacking. We are so outward focused, and we miss out on the beauty of really getting to know oneself. And this is at the core of every spiritual tradition. And then, of course, overcoming loneliness by using the technology of Zoom, of connecting with friends and creating friendships. But most important, I think what the young people are doing is they're really taking the lead in helping others, those who are suffering, those who need transportation, groceries, to go to the doctors. In our own neighborhood, we find that happening. Young people are doing that. They're really being of authentic service. And that's very beautiful to see. And we want to encourage that among the young people.
I just look at the involvement of young people now in the social movements that are happening. And I know this is uncomfortable for a lot of us older, who, want people to be more careful and kind of maintain distance from each other to avoid the COVID scourge. And I know some of the young people have a tendency to go too far, and the reality is that the protests, the deepest protest movements now are motivated and walked and talked by the young, whether they're affiliated with any religion or spiritual process or not. And I think that's extremely hopeful. I also think that ultimately we're called upon, as I think both Brother Dave and Brother Jamal are indicating, to know that the deepest security and the deepest belonging is never going to come from an association to a physical place, but rather to an awakening of a deep spiritual, inclusive consciousness, an identity that embraces rather than separates. An identity that allows us to automatically honor the dignity and the sacred presence within each and every being. Because then we are at home wherever we are.
Also, what the young people are teaching us, I feel from my observation and my interaction with them, is that true community is not just based on outer similarities of religion, culture, race. It is based mostly on inner similarities, a kinship of spirit that transcends these boundaries. We older people, we have a hard time going beyond that. But younger people in the schools and colleges, they bond easily with people, with whom they're outwardly dissimilar, but they have this kinship of spirit. And that's something I'm learning very much from the young people.
When you encounter people, how do you access those similarities? How do you sense it in
that
them?
kinship of spirit?
Right.
Yeah, so for example, someone was telling me, I love to get together with people who love the truth. In essence, it can be different in form, but they have this love of truth, or this love of being of service, a passion for that. And that bonds them as human beings. There is this inner similarity. It doesn't matter what the religion is, what the culture is, what the color of the skin is, but they have this beautiful divine link, soul to soul.
As we learn from the young people, and as we look at all those who are being so engaged in the world, I think one of the spiritual lessons we can offer is to be careful of burnout, to be careful of doing. There's so many people in my generation in the 60s and the younger people that spend 2 or 3 years just engaged in an agenda. And then they reach the end and they have nothing left. And I think if we can model, as you journey on the way, to take time to renew the inner spirit. Wendell Berry has a great poem called The Peace of Wild Things. And he talks about when despair for the world grows in me and I wake up in the night at the least sound in fear of what my life and my child's lives may be, I go lie down with the wood drake. The poem goes on to the last line, I rest in the grace of the world and I am free. And I think Berry in his poem and other poets invite us, as we're so active, to fill the tank, to go to the heart of the city to go back to nature and renew, and so we can engage again.
So, even the practice of silence can do that. Just being able to be still and go within. One comes out of it refreshed, renewed. Also, every religion has this concept of withdrawal and return. I've always loved the study of the story of the Buddha, who was so intensely busy every minute of the day. But during the rainy season, he would take 3 months off, 3 months in the rainy season. And every day, busy as he was, active, engaged, he would take time out 3 times a day to go into silence, to get renewed, refreshed. So yes, we can really learn from those wonderful stories of sages who do that.
And central to Jesus's story was the 40 days, they call it the temptation of Jesus. I like the understanding that Jesus went to the wilderness to remember who he was and who he wasn't. So he retreated for 40 days and then came down and engaged the world again. And then he retreated to a mountaintop with the story of the transfiguration. And then he returned to the valley of human need. So that rhythm that Brother Jamal talks about is so, so important.
When we hear you speak of silence and getting out in natural places, getting a change of scenery, changing your pace, awe has sometimes been spoken of as the power emotion. And I'm wondering what awe means to each of you and how can we access that?
I've learned that awe is essentially awakening to experience without the moderation of the ego mind. I've been learning that awe is life meeting itself. And then as soon as we start commenting on it, or as soon as we start noticing it, or as soon as we start evaluating it, that moment of awe has passed. I was just reading an article yesterday that talked about the consequences of taking 15 minutes of awe for awe a week. And they've been doing studies, and it was the first time I saw anything about that, and noticing what impact that had on the experience of life of those who were expressly like taking an awe walk, just taking a walk and being open to the moment, whether it's drops of water on leaves or the play of light on a field or, whatever it is.
I love what Brother Ted is saying. It's so simple, but it's so difficult. Yet it is enchanting if I'm truly present. It's a very beautiful world. And our lives, our births, our journeys, our deaths are so mysterious. But if I'm just present in the moment, that is not bifurcated by regret of the past or an anxiety about the future, then I will really be able to connect with and sense the extraordinary, enchanting beauty. I love this verse by Rumi who says, if a drop of the wine of vision could rinse your eyes, everywhere you looked, you would weep with wonder. And 2 very quick points, just 2 quotations. The traditions say the biggest awe is you yourself. You have no idea who you are. Your Christ nature, that divine spark within you, a Buddha nature, Allah nature, Elohim nature. Rumi says, do you know what hurts the soul the most? To have lived without tasting the water of your own essence. To get to know yourself, that you are awesome. There's a divine spark within you. And the other one I like by Hafiz, he says, the greatest regret on your deathbed might be that, oh universe, oh world, I did not kiss you enough. I was not present with the glory and beauty of this world.
So central to what Brother Ted and Brother Jamal said is learning how to get that inner voice of commentary out of your head to be present with awe and humility and reverence. I've been taking 5 minutes in silence every day to try to still all those voices. And to share one very quick personal story, there was a season in my life where I was facing several personal career-changing decisions that were causing me a great deal of anxiety, and I walked on Mount Rainier sunrise to the Fremont Fire Tower. And as I walked, I tried to get all the problem solving out of my head. And coming around Frozen Lake and going up the last way, the immensity of that mountain, the fact that it has been there for so long and was so beautiful, all the voices dropped away. And I felt awe. And I heard someplace deep in my spirit that it was going to be all right. That it was going to be all right. And I never forget that. That was a powerful moment of awe and reverence for me.
That sense that everything is going to be all right, I think, is a very good way to conclude this. Jamal and Ted and Dave, I thank each of you for joining us today. And I thank each of you that are watching or listening to this for joining us as well. And hope you'll connect with us on the next episode of Challenge 2.0 next week. Thank you very much. If you've enjoyed this program, found our conversations to be informative, entertaining, and thought-provoking, and the vision inspiring of people from different backgrounds who can disagree without being disagreeable, perhaps you might consider supporting our program with a contribution. Your support will not only help our program continue, it will also support the broader efforts of Paths to Understanding, our supporting parent nonprofit organization.